next one. So next one, Professor Andrekos and Varnava. Sorry. Pull out your slides.
Okay, thank you, and thank you to the organisers. This is a paper that's been in my mind for a while, and I've been reluctant to write it, and so I sort of was pushed to do it. Distinguishing between genocide and ethnic cleansing, so slight change in the title. Ottoman Empire 1915 to 23, and why this matters. So I'm conscious of time already, and I haven't even started, but we'll see how we go. So this is what I want to look at, the debates around these, question that I want to answer, definitions or terminology, if you like, which is really what I'm about today, and the historical context of the case studies. So I've broken them up like this for reasons that will become obvious. The Armenian Genocide 1915 to 16, clearly I'm on the side of those who argue that, yes, this was a genocide. Ottoman displacement of Ottoman Greeks, 1916 to 18, so that was under the Ottoman regime during the Great War. Turkish nationalist is what it is meant by here, the Kemalists, ethnic cleansing of Anatolian Greeks 1919 to 22, and the same regime, if you like, ethnic cleansing of Armenians during that same period. So there's, of course, a lot of debates. Academic and public discourses have blurred the difference between what constitutes a genocide and what constitutes ethnic cleansing, certainly in these cases. Especially true of this idea of a Greek genocide, the label given by some for atrocities committed by Ottoman and Turkish nationalist forces from the period of 1916 to 23. That includes the idea of a Pontian genocide, Pontian being the northern shores of Anatolia. Oops. So these are some of the works. I'm not going to list them, but I suppose the key thing for me, one of the key things, is the December 2007 announcement by the International Association for Genocide Scholars, resolution affirming that the 1914-23 campaign against Ottoman Greeks constituted genocide qualitatively similar to the Armenian genocide. Of course, there's also a lot of public activism happening here. Many activists and politicians have worked to have the Greek and Pontian genocide recognised alongside an Armenian genocide. Australia has been quite prominent with this as well, and this state has acknowledged, for example, this back in 2009. My question is, why is the Armenian case of 1915-16 a genocide, but not the Greek case from 1916 to 23, or that of the later Armenian case under the Kemalists? So we all know the official genocide definition. I'm not going to go into it. The key words that I've bolded there are intent to destroy in whole or in part. I think the question of intent is very important, and also what it actually in practice transpires, what is actually implemented, and we'll come to why I'm looking at that in these cases. So my sort of working definition, not that I want to recreate the legalistic term, is an intent to exterminate and destroy in part or in whole a racial, national, ethnic, religious or linguistic group through various processes of destruction, including mass killing. We can also speak about genocidal processes, which include the killing of elite, the massacre of general population, death marches to nowhere, forced starvation, mass rape, kidnapping and transferring of persons to another group, appropriation of properties and destruction of cultural heritage. And that's just naming some, but these are featuring in the cases that we're looking at. Now, official definitions of ethnic cleansing, we don't get one until the Bosnian wars. So a UN commission of experts looking into violations of international humanitarian law committed in the former Yugoslavia defined ethnic cleansing in its interim report as rendering an area ethnically homogeneous by using force or intimidation to remove persons of given groups from the area, and this was pretty much confirmed in its final report with a little bit more detail. So my working definition: intent to remove a group from specific borders, that is, the mass expulsion across an international border of members of one racial, national, ethnic or religious group by another group. This may involve various genocidal processes, including massacre, such mass expulsions within the same country is referred to as internal displacement or geographical separation, and sometimes there are other terms as well that have been used. Historical context, I want to quickly go through this. The Ottoman policies and practices of religious tolerance through the millet system, religiously based social structures led by religious elites, the Greek Orthodox, the Armenian, the Jewish minorities constituted millets under their religious heads. We had a reorganization in the 1830s known as the Tanzimat, which formalized and decentralized the system and led to a slow process of secularization. This is, of course, also part of a broader question known as the Eastern Question, involving the rivalries between European powers over their interests and their role in the Ottoman Empire and the formation of nation states from ethno-religious subject groups of the Ottoman Empire, the Greeks, Serbs, and so forth and so on. So that is you'll never get another historian giving such a quick background, I think, but I'm so conscious of time. This is a map which shows I suppose the waning, for want of a better term, of the Ottoman Empire, certainly the territorial changes which occurred from the late 18th century up until 1923. And you can see here the contraction, and the dates are given there as well. Now I want to turn to the question of population, which is a very important question in the case studies that we're looking at, because it's so contested and disputed. I'm not going to go into why I've gone with British intelligence from 1914, because they are not the best probably either. But the figures that are given by British intelligence, which actually refer to both the Ottoman and Russian empires, at least, on the border with the Ottoman Empire, so not Moscow, for instance, but this key is part of a huge, massive, detailed map, which I can't show you because you won't be able to see much from it because it's so big. It opens up. It's as big as this table here. And basically what it says is, I'm not going to say, why I picked this, other than to say that it does fit within the ranges that we get from different groups, from Ottoman and from the people themselves, from the communities themselves. Now we can see here this population distribution, basically, we're estimating 2.1 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire and another 900,000 in the Russian Empire, because this says that there are 3 million. It doesn't include Moscow and so forth and so on. And Greeks were about 1.8 million, with 500,000 in the borderlands of the Russian borderlands with the Ottoman Empire. So we'll come back to this. So these are our cases to remind you again. And I don't know how long I've got, but now I'm going to go into each case. The Armenian genocide processes of extermination. There's a lot of ways of looking at this. I've limited this to 5. We begin with persecutions and murder of the civil servants, the military personnel and elites, political, religious and so forth, at the end of 1914 and the start of 1915, culminating in the arrests and murders of the 24th of April of 1915. Second process, the mass murder through deportation of the general Armenian population, the women, the children, the elderly, beginning soon after. The intent was to mass murder these people under government-established special organization or by enforced famine. On the way to the final destination, the desert of Dezor, which actually is part of the Ottoman Empire. So they weren't deporting them to another country where they were going to be nicely received. And so clearly deportation is a cloak for extermination. And this was legalized with the temporary law of deportation passed on the 29th of May of 1915. Third process is forced assimilation of teenage girls and children to destroy Armenian society and culture by having them raised as Muslims in Muslim families. They were kidnapped. The fourth is the expropriation of Armenian properties, which was legalized through another law, allowing the Ottoman government to seize or apparently abandoned Armenian goods and properties, but they were very soon settled, of course, by Muslims who had been displaced themselves by previous wars, like the Balkan Wars. And fifth, the destruction of material culture, particularly religious buildings, but also other buildings. This is a map that shows you where they were moving these people. The main destination was down there below Dezor, which is in the middle of nowhere in the desert. There was nothing there to receive them. There were no camps, there were no food. Things that were taken to them were done secretly, clandestinely, right? Not officially sanctioned. If they got there, that's the other point. All right, so for me, that's genocide, what occurred there. And we'll look at the numbers in a moment, if hopefully I have time. The other cases, so those above processes did not occur, or at least did not occur officially or systematically in the other three cases that we're going to look at. The Ottoman internal displacement of Anatolian Greeks between 1916 and the Turkish ethnic cleansing of Anatolian Greeks and Armenians after the war, and that refers to the nationalists, the Kemalists. So from late 1916 until the end of the war, there was an Ottoman policy to relocate Greeks away from war zones. The government discouraged attacks against them because Greece was neutral, but Greeks were caught up in the Armenian genocide and arbitrary violence, and after Greece formally entered the war in June of 1917, the attacks did increase. In January of 17, the government ordered the removal of Greeks living in, for example, Samsun, which is near the Russian front, and ordered, as part of these orders, there shouldn't be any harm done to them. Of course, there was. In March 1917, around 30,000 Greeks in Ayvalik, a town on the Aegean just north of Izmir, were deported to the interior of Anatolia, but many died from beatings, starvation, and in massacres. Such orders were broadened to some coastal regions after 1917, such as Pontus. The orders were not implemented properly, and many perished in isolated massacres during the enforced movement. It's estimated between 80 to 200,000, but I'm guessing at the lower end of that. Now, after the war, the Turkish nationalists, in May of 1919, Greek forces landed in Smyrna or Izmir. This was the beginning of the Greco-Turkish War, in other words, between Greece and Mustafa Kemal's nationalist forces. The British historian Arnold Toynbee witnessed Greek massacres against Turks, and the Inter-Allied Commission confirmed the atrocities by the Greek forces. After the Treaty of Sèvres of August 1920, Greek forces headed for Ankara, outside of the designated areas that they were allowed to occupy, continuing to commit atrocities. In 1922, as they were being pushed back, they continued to commit atrocities as well. Now, reciprocally, the Turkish atrocities were committed in retaliation to the above Greek ones, and there was and the expedition to Ankara, and mostly after the Franco-Turkish War and expulsion of the Armenians had occurred in the east. The common typical sort of event that people remember is the burning of Smyrna on the 9th of September of 1922. Turkish nationalist forces captured Izmir. 4 days later, the city was on fire. It lasted until the 22nd. The fire destroyed the Greek and Armenian quarters, but not the Muslim and Jewish quarters. It was estimated that 10 to 50,000 people perished, probably 30,000, mainly Greeks and Armenians, and 100 to 200,000 fled. This gives you some idea. I need to wrap up. Yep. I'm just getting to the numbers and then to conclude. So this is where the area I'm talking about. All right, so the numbers. Armenian genocide survivors returned as part of the French army of... now I'm looking at the Armenians just quickly. A similar situation with the Greeks, where they were expelled by Turkish nationalist forces. The context is that they arrived as part of the French army of occupation, mainly genocide survivors. Now, the numbers. The Armenian Ottoman population estimated at 2.1 million, if you remember. Estimated deaths in 1915 and 16 ranged from 800 to 1.4 million. I'm saying at least 1.15 million. Period from 1919 to 23, around 100,000 deaths. So total is 1.25 million. Armenian survivors estimated at 850,000. So this gives us 2.1 million, which was the population in 1915. Those that died are 55% of the 1914 population. Greeks, on the other hand, we've said, so there was an exchange of populations after, in 1923, and we know that 1.1 million Greeks moved from what was to become Turkey to Greece, and another 50,000 to the Soviet Union and other places. And there were still 300,000 Greeks living in Turkey in 1924. So we have a total there of 1.45 million that survived out of the 1.8 million population. So based on that, I won't go through all of my calculations. There were around 350,000 who died, which is at the lower end of the estimations, and that's 19% of the population of 1914. So nowhere near the Armenian figure of 55%. So again, basically what I'm saying is that tends to show that the intent was to expel the Greeks using force and mass killings, but the intent was not to exterminate the Greeks, whereas in 1915 and 16 the intent was to exterminate the Armenians, and that's reflected in the fact that 55% of the population died. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's just move on to the next presentation.